It's a 1,500-year-old press photo. It's not on film, though. It's on ivory. There's the pulp of the poor old elephant's tusk. The Byzantines imported ivory from India and from Africa. This probably came from Africa because it's so enormous. It would have come, of course, through Egypt, up through the empire to Constantinople.
The Byzantines loved ivory. They thought it had a texture like living skin. This, then, is the only glimpse we have of life in Constantinople in about the year 420. It's a procession. Two priests are carrying the bones of St. Stephen of Jerusalem on a royal carriage into the imperial palace of Byzantium. The mighty emperor Theodosius II is walking with his ministers and soldiers right through the center of the city.
Theodosius' procession would have passed up this very street. This is modern Istanbul. In those days, in the 5th century, it was called Constantinople. We're walking between the docks and the ancient centre of the city. I suspect it was much the same in those days, but there would have been thousands of people watching the emperor on his way to the palace. Do you know, these processions, especially at that time, were a very tense affair. These sort of cities, these great classical cities, were 1,000 years old. But the Christian bishops that ran them were starting to look at them with brand new eyes. The times really were a-changing. They saw the rich on the way to church to tend to their souls, kicking beggars out the way by the doors of the church, children mutilated by their parents to make them look more pitiful. And they saw the rich women walking, they said, with 1,000 meals swinging from their ears, and they didn't like what they saw. The Christian bishops wanted a moral city, a sexless city, a pure city, and a more equitable city too.
So that, perhaps, is why the emperor isn't sitting in his carriage, but walking in the street and carrying a candle with his courtiers. And the bones of a poor man from Palestine are riding in the royal coach. The emperor's procession was on its way to a grand square, halfway between the palace and the court church.
I think our ivory procession would have passed through here, right through the heart of the ancient city. Now, you see that Turkish bath over there? That's in about the same place as the gate on our ivory. And see the great high dome on the gate? And see that figure of Christ, that face of Christ on the gate? That was such a famous figure. It was called Christ of the Gateway, the most famous and influential portrait of Christ. It was copied from the great shining ivory statue of Zeus of the Seven Wonders. That was parked in a palace just over there. Now, think of our procession moving along. You see, they're going past this great portico, 3 high stories of it, people peering out arches, looking down, swinging their incense, pleased to see the saint arriving in the city to make the New Jerusalem, joining heaven to earth. And over there, look, that's about a spot where the church, the brand new church of St. Stephen is being built. It's ready to receive the relics, but they haven't finished the roof and the tilers are still working away up there. But the Empress is proudly waiting by the door, holding a cross.
And that is quite extraordinary. For the first time in the ancient world, the centre of attention is not the emperor, but an empress. She carries the cross of victory. She receives the holy relics into her church. It's probably the Virgin Empress Pulcheria. In that most ancient language, signs and symbols, the little ivory is telling us about an ancient revolution, and one that still affects the world today. In the first years, many of Christianity's most famous pictures were made here, in the grounds of the great monastery of St. John Studios at Constantinople. These monasteries were Pulcheria's holy battlegrounds, the places where she conjured up the sacred images and metaphors with which she waged her earthly arguments. At the centre of this ancient image factory, one of Constantinople's oldest churches, where the sacred signs and stories were put to powerful use. Imagine that it is Easter, April the 15th, 428, and that this nice new church is filled with all the nobles of Constantinople, men downstairs, women upstairs in the galleries. Suddenly, there was a great hush. The imperial guard and the emperor and all his family have walked into the church. Now, in the middle of these churches, there's a stone pulpit. For more than a century now, preachers have been giving fire and brimstone from these pulpits, using all the language, all the signs and symbols of the Christian faith and the ethics of the Bible. They laid out the whole structure of this brand new Christian empire. And the emperor and his family listened in humility.
Right on this line here, there was an altar rail. It separated the main body of the church from the high altar. Only the emperor and his priests were allowed in here, close to the divine mystery of communion.
In 428, though, things were rather different. Theodosius, the emperor, was usually accompanied to the altar by his sister, Pulcheria. They'd ruled together since they'd been children, two frightened toddlers in a palace filled with intrigues and plots for the succession. When she was 14, Pulcheria had hit upon the answer. She dedicated an altar to her own virginity and to the rule of the emperor. From that moment on, they ruled a strange, sacred couple like Joseph and Mary, and there were no plots for the succession. It had also given Pulcheria a unique role within the church. On that particular Easter day, though, things turned out rather differently. Pulcheria's way to the altar was barred by the new patriarch of Constantinople, one Nestorius. He said that only men could enter the sanctuary. Pulcheria was aghast. Her new role as a virgin had projected women in a different way. She was as pure as gold, she said. She had kept herself as soft as fleece to receive the Holy Spirit. Have I not given birth to God, she cried. Nestorius, though, was a man of the old school. He preferred to see women as the daughters of Eve, that unfortunate lady who dabbled in snakes and sex and sin. You, he said to Pulcheria, have given birth to Satan. And there you have it, really. The three roles of women laid out in the early Christian church: sinners, virgins, and mothers. By opening the debate, Pulcheria not only advanced the role of the Virgin Mary and women in Byzantium, but defined the role of women in Christendom forever. Encouraged by Pulcheria, the next full council of the church declared Mary, the mother of Jesus, to be Mary, the mother of God. It was a defining moment. Nestorius' challenge to the Empress Pulcheria was now seen as an insult to the Virgin Mary. He was declared a heretic and exiled. Thanks to Pulcheria, the family of the Emperor of Byzantium had become a mirror image of the Holy Family in the court of heaven. That is why these medieval emperors offer their city and an image of this church, St. Sophia, Byzantium's cathedral, for the protection of the Virgin Mary. Christ's mother is their mother too. After Pulcheria,
The emperors of Byzantium ruled by divine right and by right of birth, and all later Western kings imitated them. Pulcheria had cast that spell of power and sanctity that still surrounds the offices of government today. She'd also changed the way that men saw women and women saw themselves. Once more, ancient images tell the story. Pagan Greeks and Romans loved public displays of sexuality inside the city. They seemed to hold the force of life within them. They gave assurances of immortality. The Christians, though, had gazed upon eternity. Just as they destroyed the pagan temples, so they attacked the pagan body image. Byzantine preachers said that the silent power of nakedness threatened anarchy within the family and the state, and it was covered up. Women like Pulcheria, who once had flaunted wealth and beauty at the public baths, now lived regretful, celibate, in hermits' huts inside their marble palaces. No longer was each man an Alexander and every woman a Venus. Right through the empire, the cities of Byzantium were filling up with Christian piety. Yet it was still a magic, superstitious world. A world, too, where those who knew the will of God held quite enormous power. Hermits like St. Simon of the Pillar, who preached in Syria, and did not hesitate to question the behavior of the emperor himself.
And since your heart has forgotten the Lord your God, who gave you the imperial crown and the imperial throne, and since you have become a friend of the feckless, faithless Jew, then know this: soon you will face divine judgment, and then you will raise your hands to heaven and moan.
Impiety, then, brought down the wrath of God. Piety, on the other hand, brought prosperity, good government, and victory too. The preachers kept their eyes on the great cities and on the countryside as well. For the people who fed and fueled Byzantium were also at the mercy of the Lord. Deep in Turkish Anatolia, this little village was once the city of St. Michael of 10,000 angels, famed for its fine churches. In Byzantium's countryside, life was on a knife edge between prosperity and starvation, between flesh and the devil. Magic stones still eased the pain of reaping and of childbirth. Magic images, half cockerel, half snake, all dressed in armour, still kept the evil eye at bay. Byzantium was built on the memories of this pagan past, sometimes even from the same old stones. Ancient demons haunted the countryside, stopped up wells, curdled milk, and threatened plague and madness. Many saints were really doctors, ministering to a madness born of holy terror. Their prayers drove out the ancient devils, safeguarded animals and crops. For archaeologists, of course, such goings-on are very hard to excavate, yet sometimes there are clues to them. Still lying on the swelling earth,